Good morning. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Today we're going to cover Revelation chapter 18, verses 1 through 10, and this one is called Babylon is Fallen, Part 1. The Bible often speaks of God's judgment, but nowhere is the judgment of God more apparent than in the book of Revelation. In Revelation, we see the culmination of numerous prophetic references. Here's an example from Jesus in Matthew 13, verses 40 to 43. Therefore, as the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of this age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and those who practice lawlessness, and will cast them into the furnace of fire. There will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. In the passage above, all things that offend in the New King James is translated as stumbling blocks in the New American Standard. What trips people up and makes them worship anything different than the one true God? This made me think about what angers God the most between a false religion like Islam or a false representation of Christianity. For example, the prosperity gospel comes to mind, teaching a name it and claim it and blab it and grab it approach to God. While the promises of a financial windfall might draw people to those churches, when God doesn't come through for anyone but the pastor of the church, who is pilfering from the pockets of parishioners, there are many people who do not just walk away from the church, but instead walk away from God. The spiritually immature often are incapable of differentiating between the failures of a fallible Christian and the incorrectly identified failure of an infallible God. The pastors of prosperity gospel churches are the wolves in sheep's clothing, fleecing the flocks. Now let's look at a false religion. Islam is one of many religions that worships the moon god. The first historical representation of this was the worship of Sin, which was the name of the moon god in Sumerian mythology, and likely was the reason that Nimrod built the Tower of Babel. The worship of Sin was the first false religion. This ties directly to the moon god of Islam. The Holy Bible recognizes Satan as the greatest deceiver. At the same time, the Quran openly states that Allah is the greatest deceiver, without any shame. Certainly, Allah is Satan, and consequently, Muslims worship Satan. Perhaps in these chapters of Revelation, God will judge Babylon and the false religion of Islam. With that done, Satan could come out of the shadows to be worshipped as the Antichrist, as Satan, rather than as Allah. In the previous chapter of Revelation, we heard about God's impending judgment on the harlot of Babylon, identified as a city on many waters. While there are many different opinions on the correct interpretation of this chapter, as well as the correct location of the city in question, I tend to think it is referring to Rome, and most specifically Vatican City. Vatican City is the religious capital of the city, while Rome is the economic capital of the city. We don't know how close we are to the tribulation. The world does seem to be spiraling out of control. At the least, it would seem that we are in the days of Matthew 24 and Luke 21, but it also is likely that other people have thought they were in the end days. Even the Apostle John thought he was living in the end days. But maybe anyone who has walked this earth after Jesus is living in the end times. Personally, the reestablishment of Israel as a nation was a delineating line. But assuming we are in the last times, if Babylon was completely destroyed tomorrow, how would it affect us? We would read the news, but it likely would not affect us at all. But how would it affect us or all of the world if Rome and Vatican City were destroyed? Rome is an historically significant city, and that event would deeply affect the masses of people who had lived there or visited. But the destruction of Vatican City would affect far more than the 1.4 billion Catholics in the world, roughly 17.7% of the Earth's population. It would affect the masses being said for the masses of people too. Mystery Babylon previously has been identified as a city by the angel and the place of false religion. Catholic leaders think that Babylon is actually Jerusalem, but with a cursory understanding of Revelation, knowing that it will involve God's plan of redemption to the Jews, his chosen people, it is highly unlikely that Jerusalem will be that location. But then again, I don't know. Perhaps the abomination of desolation that will desecrate the Jewish temple is the straw that will break the camel's back. And that camel will not be able to pass through the eye of the needle either. But the judgment we will read about in Revelation 18 seems to be the end of all religion, except for the worship of the Antichrist. I'm still guessing that this chapter will announce the destruction of Vatican City and Rome because of the many ways that Catholicism has corrupted God's church. God's church was the mystery revealed in the days after Jesus. Rites and rituals over relationship, anti-Semitism, self-identifying the Catholic Church as the recipients of God's promises to Israel, a focus on wealth and power over love, ruling with heavy-handedness throughout its history, the sexual abuse scandals between priests and children, particularly young boys, and a turn toward the ecumenical movement. All of these have corrupted the church. That being said, there are many Catholics who have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, and the failings of their church are not their own failures. I'm not anti-Catholic in relation to people, but I'm not a fan of the leadership or direction of the Catholic Church, particularly the trappings of the Vatican. But I cannot state this with any more knowledge than a guess. After all, the Old Testament prophecies concerning Israel were thought by many to be merely symbolic when Israel ceased from being a nation in 70 AD. But when Israel once again returned to being a nation in 1948, it was obvious that God meant what he said and said what he meant when mentioning Israel in those prophecies. Maybe Babylon means Babylon. Things would have to change, but God can change anything he wants and as quickly as he wants. The ancient city of Babylon is in complete ruins, but across the Euphrates, there's a large metropolis, the Babel Governorate, with a population of nearly 2.5 million people. Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, bragged that they had conquered Babylon without a battle, as we can read about in Daniel 5. Under Alexander the Great, Babylon became a capital, and there are yet unfulfilled prophecies concerning Babylon's future in Isaiah 13 and 14 and Jeremiah 50 and 51 that tell us that Babylon will be destroyed, will never be inhabited again, and its building materials never will be reused. That also sounds like a nuclear attack. These chapters also tell us that the destruction will be similar to what occurred in Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, let's read our first passage. Revelation chapter 18, verses 1 through 3 says this: After these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. The chapter starts with another metatauta in Greek, after these things, tying this chapter to the previous one. After the angels shared with John that Babylon would be judged, that judgment will be at hand, announced by another angel. This Babylon will become the center of false religion during the tribulation. And if a pre-tribulation rapture occurs, those not raptured will remain on the earth. And that unraptured church might just continue with business as usual. At the same time, churches filled with true believers before the rapture will be completely vacant after the rapture. But as stated earlier, under pressure, people will have the fight or flight instinct. For some, their anger toward God will increase, and that will include atheists who claim not to believe in God. Yes, it is ludicrous to be angry at God without believing in God, but it will happen. And then others will look for something larger than self and will flock to this false religion, unaffected by the rapture. The Antichrist will use that false religion for a time, but it will reach a point of no return. The Antichrist will desire to be the one being worshipped, and his 10 kings will destroy this city, whether it be Babylon, Rome, and Vatican City, or some other location. Even though those 10 kings will be physically responsible for the destruction of Babylon, it will be God's judgment. It will become the place where demons and evil spirits will dwell. Birds in the Bible are frequently a symbol of Satan and evil, and the unclean birds will reside there as well. Let's look at the next passage. Revelation chapter 18, verses 4 through 8 says this, "And I heard another voice from heaven saying, 'Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sin and lest you receive of her plagues. For her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Render to her just as she rendered to you, and repay her double according to her works. And the cup which she has mix double for her. And the measure that she glorified herself and lived luxuriously, in the same measure give her torment and sorrow. For she says in her heart, I sit as queen, and am no widow, and will not see sorrow. Therefore her plagues will come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord God who judges her.'" After the great earthquake of the seventh bowl judgment, we had earlier read this statement. Revelation 16:19 says, "Now the great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and great Babylon was remembered before God, to give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath." Many cities across the world will fall with the largest earthquake in the earth's existence, but Babylon is specifically mentioned as remembered before God, as a reminder for God to pour out the cup of wine of the fierceness of his wrath. The wine is blood, destruction. Again, Babylon was the birthplace of false religion at the Tower of Babel. That could make Babylon a symbol, or could also be referring to the false religion headquartered in a specific city, like Rome, the city on 7 hills, seemingly spoken of in Revelation 17. This section includes God's offer for repentance, and it seems likely that this offer from God will not be just for those dwelling in Rome and Vatican City or Babylon, but to all remaining members of the false religion worldwide. The destruction of this once glorious city seems like will take 24 hours, but we also see it mentioned as 1 hour. Even though the actual destruction of Mystery Babylon will be from the hands of the 10 kings of the Antichrist, the judgment will come directly from God. Okay, let's look at our last passage today. Revelation chapter 18, verses 9 through 10 says this: "The kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance for fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come." Other expositors have mentioned that this could also be God's judgment on the United States. The angel did specify in Revelation 17 that the harlot is a city. Babylon is a city. Regardless, the United States seems to be absent in end times biblical prophecy. But as the United States did not exist when the Bible was written, any representation of the United States biblically would need to be symbolic. Though this often has been attributed to Billy Graham, his wife Ruth wrote this: "If God does not judge America soon, he will have to apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah." While this statement correctly identifies the pervasive sin of the United States, it makes assumptions of God's character that we should refrain from making. God's righteousness, God's plan, God's purpose, God's timing. We are waiting for a time when we all will be united by the love of Jesus and will not struggle with sin, pain, or tears. We are reaching a time in Revelation when all three of those will be commonplace. God uses our pain to bring us to Him. He is the only solution, and with the existence of this world hanging in the balance, there are not many more opportunities for people to turn to Him. Psalm 9, verses 7 through 8 says this: "But the Lord shall endure forever. He has prepared His throne for judgment. He shall judge the world in righteousness, and He shall administer judgment for the peoples in uprightness." We will finish Revelation chapter 18 tomorrow. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Have a blessed day.